So for our last talk, yeah, we have Katja. We're really glad that she's joining us today. And in some respects, I think she'll help us get to the heart of, some of the things that we want to do with this group. Namely, the exploration of feminist science fiction, and kind of understanding the role of utopian imagination in political change. Through one example of a particular book. I've also, just to let Katja know, put a few books up here that I think are a bit relevant to our, two quite not well-known Slovenian translations of Ursula Le Guin, one being Left Hand of Darkness, and the other word for world is forest. We also have Ursula Le Guin's Carrier Bag, Theory of Fiction, with an introduction by Donna Haraway, and Posthuman Feminism by Rossi Bradotti. And I believe you're familiar with all these works as well, and kind of touch upon the topics we'll explore. Just give them here for our participants here, but feel free also to reference these works.
You want this one as well?
Sure. This is perhaps a bit less known, but Ruth Levitas' Utopia as Method, the Imaginary Reconstitution of Society. She goes into perhaps historic mission of sociology or social sciences and humanities at large to think through utopia seriously, but not just as kind of ideals, but turn it into a kind of a method, using an architectural mode, looking at the wealth of different experiences that are possible to a kind of constructive or an architectural mode, and also an ontological mode, meaning thinking through what kind of subjectivities would such societies produce. But enough about that, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for letting me know about the books. I was intrigued about what they are, so it's great to know that I'm in such good company. I don't know this last book, so I've noted it down. I have to look it up. It seems really, really great and very interesting. Thanks for the invitation, and for letting me also and us follow the day of discussions, which was really inspiring for me. I'm really curious to see where your work will take you. You're really important politically. So today I will present a little bit on Shulamith Firestone, which is an author I have come to know very well. I've translated her book, The Dialectic of Sex, into Slovene in 2019. I'm now preparing a scholarly edition of the work and an edited volume. And it's an author that has been in a way rediscovered in the past few years. After being not so well regarded, I would say, in the history of feminist thought and feminist theory. And the reason it's being, I think, rediscovered is that she offered many very prescient ideas about about the reorganization of society, which touch upon the economy, ecology, gender relations, sexuality, the family, urbanism, education. So kind of really, if you want, total reorganization of our social structures from a socialist feminist perspective. So just to know, to have an idea of how much I should say about what, I was wondering if I could ask you how many of you have read, are familiar with The Dialectic of Sex? How many of you know it? So I'm not repeating too much of what everyone knows already. It's just, has anyone read the book or is familiar with it?
What?
No, okay. Alia, okay.
I think it's just
No.
Yeah, sure. It was. Okay, no, that's great. I mean, yeah, it's just so that I make sure I'm not really repeating things that are obvious to everyone. Okay, so today, the book that Firestone wrote, The Dialectic of Sex, she published it when she was 25 years old. In 1969. It was in a way a result of her activism in the women's movement, in the radical feminist movement. She co-founded also several radical feminist groups in New York and Chicago. But she also kind of retreated from the movement right after publishing the book, and didn't publish anything anymore until 1998, when she published Airless Faces. This is a very tiny book, a collection of short stories based on her experience with mental illness and her experience with being institutionalized as a patient with schizophrenia, but also the people that she knew that had these kinds of experiences. It's also a very interesting work, I think, but that's for maybe another time. So I will focus on her, let's say, only theoretical book on feminism, which is The Dialectic of Sex, a case for feminist revolution. And rather than discussing so much her intellectual philosophical influences, which are most importantly Simone de Beauvoir, Marx and Engels, and Freud, I will also not here focus upon the many critiques of her work that have been leveled, especially that her work is naively technophiliac, that it is biologically deterministic, and also that it doesn't, that it offers a very preposterous account of race. I will mention these critiques only in passing, but I will not dwell on it. What I will focus on here is rather how the dialectic of sex offers a critique of society. So it is a kind of critical social theory. And then in what way it translates this critique into an imagination of a different feminist future. So how it works as a kind of speculative feminist critical manifesto. I will especially dwell on her understanding of ecology. And then in the end, towards the end, I will discuss how, let's say, Firestone herself conceptualizes imagination, the utopian imagination and speculation, how she understands science fiction, how she understands the relationship between art and technology in relation to this question of utopian imagination and its actualization in political reality. So in a way, this would be touching upon her meta understanding of what she's doing in the dialectic as well. And then I will conclude by contextualizing a bit Firestone's work in relation to Donna Haraway, her understanding of science fiction, and in a way emphasize what I think of this work is really interesting still today, both methodologically and content-wise. Okay, so I have mentioned that Firestone offers a socialist feminist critique of society and imagination of a different future. And to understand the specific kind of socialist feminism that she is articulating, it's also important to know the context in which she was writing. So she was writing, she was an activist of the New Left in the United States, where discourses about the end of capitalism, class struggle, anti-colonialism, but also Black liberation, civil rights movements, those were of course, very current, very much the order of the day. And many of the women who ended up forming radical feminist groups were also activists in those movements, Firestone including. So when she's discussing the revolution that she wants to propose, she does not dwell so much on the details on how, although she proposes quite concrete also solutions, she does not dwell so much and in detail in, let's say, a class analysis, an analysis of labor exploitation, the creation of surplus value and so on, because those kinds of critiques and analysis were in a way for her and the circle of people which she was writing for and about a kind of presupposition. So what she focuses on is what was actually in a way new, radical, and provocative in that circle, and that is to outline that women's oppression and children's oppression, which is not something that was even tackled by many feminists at the time, are also important things to think about, to critique and undo, and imagine a different kind of future for gender relations, for the family, and so on. So in the Dialectic of Sex, she offers an analysis of sex class oppression, which she links to the exploitation of reproduction. This is why many feminists, many later readers have also considered her a biological determinist, but I think many have then argued that, including me, that this is a kind of misreading of her work. So Firestone does recognize that biological reproduction in certain circumstances and in the past has often led to the exploitation of reproductive labor. So pregnancy, childbirth, lactation, and then the kind of social reproductive labor that often comes with it has been shouldered mostly by women in many societies throughout history. And she makes an argument for that not to be the case anymore. And her solution, which has also become famous and even infamous, is also by, let's say, aiding this process of ending sex class oppression through the introduction of reproductive technologies, artificial reproduction, including ectogenesis or artificial wombs. Some have taken that to mean that she offers a technological solution to what is actually kind of technological developments would never bring a change in themselves. But the question is how these technologies are developed and how they are deployed. So only if deployed to progressive ends, only if taken up by feminists for feminist purposes. She talks about taking control of the means of reproduction. Would that lead to an actual liberation of people who can birth from the burden of constant reproductive labor? She, as mentioned, she assumes that class exploitation is a problem and that it's deeply linked to sex class oppression. So for her, women have mostly functioned as reproductive laborers, men have often functioned as productive laborers in this kind of gender division of labor that is known also from Marxist feminist analysis. She argues for abolishing both. And her idea of abolition is quite radical. So she not only proposes that automation could help abolish some, actually the institution of wage labor itself, as well as reproductive labor exploitation, but also the socialization of both reproduction and the necessary labor that would remain, the labor necessary to sustain societies. So she would actually, yes, as said, she argues in favor of abolishing wage labor as an institution. And a crucial means is not only reproduction, socialization of labor, but also the introduction of what today we call universal basic income. So keep in mind that this is 1969. This is quite an early articulation of this idea. And what is interesting, so this idea, of course, has become quite current in the past years, even quite mainstream, as I'm sure you all well know. But what is interesting is that for Firestone, universal basic income would not only secure the independence of everyone from the market, from the necessity to sell their labor power on the market, but also the economic and existential independence of women from men and children from adults. So I think this is also a very interesting view on this proposal for a universal basic income. So as I mentioned, she also, in relation to that, proposes a kind of restructuring of urbanism, how our lives should be organized in terms of campus-like towns with information centers where each would have their own room, but also a lot of common spaces like kitchens and cultural spaces and so on. So a kind of total reorganization. Another topic that she tackles quite explicitly in one chapter is children's oppression, and she links it to women's oppression, to sex class oppression. She talks about how in patriarchal nuclear families, certain power chauvinism is being developed, according to which we tend to view our own biological children as our property, through which name and of course property itself is are passed on and reproduced. And she argues for undoing this kind of proprietarian relationship to children. So to stop fetishizing biological offspring, and here it's where her technological imagination comes in, this kind of ectogenesis, artificial reproduction would for her lead to children being the property of no one. So maybe biological ties would not even be known or important anymore. And children would be raised in intergenerational households of approximately 7 to 10 people. It's very interesting that she envisions a contract that would bind these members of the household to stay together, to provide for a certain amount of years, to provide some stability to younger children. But then everyone would be free to leave, to change household, go to live on their own, and so on. And these households would be intergenerational. They would include people from young adults to older adults, people who can reproduce, who cannot reproduce. So she in a way recognizes that families, nuclear families, do play a role in society. They provide both material security, emotional support, and she says these are important needs that need to be in a way respected and met also by any kind of alternative organization. And as said, this kind of households for her would meet those needs as well. Accordingly, she also envisions reorganization of education, an abolishment of compulsory public schooling, and an introduction of free information libraries with networked information centers. So in a way, envisioning the internet in '69, where people would learn according to their capacities, needs, and interests. The final chapter of the dialectic, which talks about her revolutionary demands for change, starts actually with ecology, with a discussion of ecology. What I find interesting in this discussion, I mean, well, ecological discussions about ecology or climate change, and of course have evolved since in a very significant way. But what I find interesting in her take on the issue is that she refuses any kind of essentialization of nature and ecology. She refuses ideas about going back to nature, going back to preserving a natural order. She acknowledges that humans have already altered nature as any other kind of species, living species, alters their environment, and that it's not possible to go back. What we need, she says, is a new ecological balance which would, secure what we today we would call, I suppose, the sustainability of our environments, and a kind of new humane ecological balance. She points to demographic explosion and how this leads to non-sustainable ways of living. So too many people leading unsustainable lives. And she argues that these are, as she calls them, real ecological problems, that they cannot be solved only with a redistribution of wealth, although she acknowledges that this is very important. But she says redistribution alone will not solve the kind of burden on the environment that exponential demographic growth, especially in some countries, so she comes from the US, especially in the global north, would bring upon the environment. What I find interesting is also that unlike some, let's say, thinkers about ecology, also feminist thinkers, she is very wary of demonizing any kind of specific technology, for instance, nuclear technologies or contraception and abortion. She rather insists that so technology in itself, or even any kind of specific technology, is not good or bad in itself, but rather the way it is developed and the way it is used can be either progressive or to oppressive ends. And she also discusses what is quite interesting, the denial of truths which are public and obvious to all about, let's say, the burdens on the environment. She poses the question why everyone knows about this, but no one acts about it. What are the kind of interests behind? And one of the things she diagnoses is also the kind of, what she says, the chauvinism which develops in the family. I find this interesting because I don't think that comes up very much in current discussions. So for her, the patriarchal family, nuclear family, breeds this kind of fetishization of biological offspring so that no one wants to give up reproducing, if you want. But also more broadly, the idea of, us versus them. So caring for my own family, my own nation, my own way of life, at the expense of the public good, a kind of failure of including other people, other ways of life into our own political imagination, which she also links to the way we are socialized in the nuclear family. And in the end, so for her to find a new ecological balance, we would need, as she says, I quote, a radical change of humans' relationship both to their production and their reproduction. And this is what feminism should also achieve. So one of the tasks of feminism is to support this kind of cultural acceptance of a new ecological balance based on this new understanding or new relationship to both our production and reproduction. So which means what I have mentioned before, the end of wage labor, the end of the production of value, what we have, what I suppose Marco Hocevar has talked about in the first talk, letting go of this need to produce more value and economic growth. And on the other hand, for Firestone, also very important is letting go of the fetishization of biological reproduction, the reproduction of biological offspring. So those would be, let's say, her ideas, her visions for a different society. I will say now something about how she understands the production of this vision. So how she understands the creation of a new political imagination. So her meta theory of utopian ideas, if you want. So to understand this, I need to mention how she understands, so her theory of culture. So Firestone defines culture as the attempt of humans to realize the possible in the actual. For her, historically, culture has been mainly developing along two axes, which she calls the aesthetic modus and the technological modus. And the aesthetic modus would proceed by imagining what is possible. In the aesthetic modus, she counts arts, culture, but also speculative ways of thinking like philosophy, theology, maybe some of the humanities, and so on. And in the technological modus, which would proceed by realizing what is possible in the actual, as she puts it, she includes both all natural sciences, but also social sciences, including, for instance, scientific Marxism. That's just an example. And Firestone actually argues that a true revolution would bring an end to this kind of dichotomy between the aesthetic and the technological modus, so that culture would proceed as one in a kind of interdisciplinary, not just exchange, but actual interdisciplinary co-creation of new visions that would then be realized. That's a kind of very early articulation of an interdisciplinary idea. So for Firestone, the uniquely human faculty of awareness of the self within an environment. And this is, of course, debatable. We can say something about this in the discussion. The way she thinks this is in a way unique to humans, but she says that this allows humans to project mentally states of being that do not exist at the moment. I'm quoting now. Able to construct a past and the future, the human being becomes a creature of time, a historian and a prophet. More than this, he can imagine objects and states of being that have never existed and may never exist in the real world. He becomes a maker of art. End of quote. Just a note, Firestone uses the generic masculine as a universal, which I think is also, well, indicative of the time in which she was writing. And when she, so as mentioned, while technology can bring about what is possible for artists to imagine, artists and cultural producers for her frequently anticipate by decades the innovations that technology will then eventually make real. She says, I quote, "The art of science fiction developed in the main only a half century in advance of and now coexists with the scientific revolution that is transforming it into reality. For example, an innocuous one, the moon flight," end of quote. So for her, science fiction has this kind of anticipatory role, anticipatory possibility. It functions as a kind of thought experiment by testing what kind of technological advancements could bring about socially. So what kind of social relations they would instigate, how we could approach them in changed conditions, and so on. A quite interesting argument has been made by Victoria Margaret. She's a literary scholar, the author of the only monograph I know of about Firestone, Neglected or Misunderstood. And in an edited volume that will come out this year that I have edited, she writes about the dialectic of sex itself as an example of science fiction. But this, I would add, works only in as much as science fiction is not understood as just fiction, so as just imagination, but is seen as another tool of critical social analysis and political argumentation. So Margaret writes, Firestone seems to be close to explicitly offering her vision of a post-revolutionary society as an exercise in fiction. By showing that a non-oppressive society is conceivable in the imagination, she understands herself to be taking a vital step towards its realization. I think what is interesting is that an analogous understanding of science fiction has actually been proposed much later by Donna Haraway, and that's since her Cyborg Manifesto, I think from '89, if I'm not mistaken. As well as, so Haraway writes about this kind of understanding of science fiction as a tool of the imagination, but also a political tool of critique of society and imagination of a different kind of political arrangement, social arrangement, in the Cyborg Manifesto, but also until today in her latest book, Staying with the Trouble, where she further develops the proximity of the concepts that she calls, I quote, science fiction, speculative fabulation, string figures, speculative feminism, science fact so far, end of quote. So it's all SF. And Haraway adds, I quote, science fact and speculative fabulation need each other and both need speculative feminism, end of quote. This is quite interesting because Haraway has been very critical of Firestone. She has argued that Firestone is a technophile, that she puts forth a kind of domineering understanding of the relationship of humans to their environment. And there is some truth to the matter. So Firestone does talk about, yes, as I said, realizing what is possible, what is imagined in reality, through knowledge. She tends to understand knowledge as power in this kind of way as Francis Bacon understood it, and thus that humans can shape their environment almost at will. So there is this kind of element there that might make many ecologically minded feminists a bit wary of her thought. But at the same time, there are very many, I think, common points of intersection between ecofeminism between certain kinds of cyber feminism or feminist philosophies of technology, between the thought of Donna Haraway and Shulamith Firestone. So what is further interesting in this conjunction is that the way Firestone understands science fiction and the way science fiction has been understood in relation to Firestone. So for instance, in this article that Victoria Margrave wrote, where she parallels the understanding of reproduction in the dialectic to, for instance, feminist science fiction such as March Percy's novels, The Woman on the Edge of Time, He, She, and It, and so on, is that there is a certain proximity between this understanding of science fiction and then the genre of the political manifesto. So both science fiction and political manifestos articulate visions of the future, so speculations about how the future could look like. And especially in the case of critical manifestos, which Katie Wicks, a political philosopher, develops in analogy with the concept of the critical utopia, and she considers critical manifestos to be the genres in which both Firestone and Haraway write. So Haraway is also an author of many manifestos, the Cyborg Manifestos, the Companion Species Manifesto, and so on. So she talks about, Katja Wicks talks about critical manifestos as this kind of texts that offer proposals for a different society, but not blueprints for a perfect society. They work as thought experiments, as kind of provocations for readers to think with the authors and through the kind of changes that they propose, instead of in a way presenting those changes as absolutely necessary and unavoidable. Firestone herself reflects upon her own proposals, which I have presented before, as precisely in those terms. So she calls them dangerously utopian. She explicitly says that they are the fruit of an individual imagination and therefore limited by it. She says, I quote, "Keep in mind that these are not meant as final answers, that in fact the reader could probably draw up another plan that would satisfy as well or better the four structural imperatives." She calls her proposals a very rough plan that is, I quote, "meant to stimulate thinking in fresh areas rather than dictate action," end of quote. So Margaret says that Firestone's utopian imagining is thus not monological, but dialogical, meaning that she invites us to think with her. So Firestone says that actual change will always be the fruit of collective labor. So she says, I quote, "any specific direction must arise organically out of the revolutionary action itself," end of quote. So it will be the result of collective negotiation, arguments, consensus seeking, and so on. But, and this is important, as mentioned, she nevertheless insists that the minimal requirements for any feminist revolutionary project need to be met by any kind of alternative society. And so those minimal requirements, she articulates them based on her critique of current society, especially her own society, that is the United States of the time. But also she bases this kind of articulation upon her critique of alternative projects that for her have all to some degree failed. She analyzes the Paris Commune, the kibbutz in Israel, kibbutzis, in Israel, the Russian Revolution, and so on. So based upon her analysis, she articulates minimal requirements for any revolutionary feminist projects. And those would be, among them are the socialization of reproduction, so of reproductive and productive labor, the economic, political, and existential autonomy of women and children, their full inclusion into society, and full sexual liberation beyond gender, so with the abolition of gender, with the abolition of monogamy, the family, and romantic love. So to conclude, I will just sum up what I think is interesting for today about Shulamith Firestone and her proposals, and this is both the methodology and how she reflects upon it. I would also like to mention that the book, The Dialectic of Sex, this is not, so don't, if you will ever read it, don't expect to find a kind of very detailed theory or meticulous study of any kind of phenomenon. It is so it is a manifesto. It is a book that comes from the movement and it's written for the movement. Nevertheless, in it, one can find, as mentioned, this kind of methodological reflections on what it means to articulate proposals for a different future. And one can find, I think, very interesting, quite practical proposals on which we can develop further, which we can reflect upon, as we are invited to do through this kind of dialogical mode of engagement with her text. So these are the concrete proposals for the automation of productive and reproductive labor, for a universal basic income, for the end of the family, the end of gendered categories, childhood liberation, actually ending the category of childhood itself, for finding a new ecological balance, ending wage labor, developing an interdisciplinary culture beyond the division between art and technology or art and science, the development of information banks and a transformation of education, networked flow of information, and so on. So a whole host of ideas for how to change and reshape our societies that can be thought through in a critical engagement with her text. Yes, and that's where I would end my presentation. I'm very curious to hear what you think, what you find interesting, what you find, I don't know, problematic, or if you think there might be anything useful for your project. Or if you have any questions, if you would like to hear anything more about any of the things I have touched upon.
Yeah, I was really interested into this universal basic income thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really important for our present and future. Like, it would really release a lot of pressure, especially when it comes to artists. Like, we wouldn't feel inclined that much to constantly produce and make new works, and maybe we would have more time to think through our projects and just maybe rest, if that is possible. But I'm just wondering, like, how far are we from this universal basic income? Like, she actually wrote about it in 1969, and it's out of the question that it will happen in, I think, in the region, probably even in Europe in the next decade, probably. Or yeah.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting what you mentioned, because what I think is most often theorized in relation to the universal basic income is how it would or could relieve or replace some of the social provisions or welfare provisions, like healthcare and so on, or pension or social support. But what I think is not so often maybe thought about is all the other ways that it could benefit people. And you mentioned one, so artists, and how it could help, of course, artists simply survive, but also rest, and have the necessary time for developing, even for creating, for gaining new thoughts, gaining new knowledge, new ideas, and so on. And so this is, I think, one arena. Firestone talks about, as mentioned, the kind of autonomy it could give to women and children when they wouldn't be economically dependent upon men, upon adults. And I have recently talked to a friend who raised the issue of how a universal basic income could really significantly help mental mental health patients, psychiatric patients, also addicts, alcoholics, for instance, how much economic precarity actually is a part of the symptoms that people experience in people who go for treatment to psychiatric hospitals and so on. So yes, I think all these arenas are maybe underexplored, all these arenas in which universal basic income could prove helpful. But yes, I agree with you, and I hope it is. I mean, I'm not sure. I don't think it's yet a won battle, or you know, something that everyone would embrace. But of course, progressively more people are. And again, I suppose the question, or with Firestone, we could say that the issue is how we, you know, what kind of system we develop, and how do we implement it, and you know, whether it becomes then, you know, just a kind of okay, so now everyone receives a couple €100 a month, and you have to pay for all your health services and everything else, or if it's, you know, how it is framed, how it is organized, or if it's a supplement to what was mentioned before, universal what was it, universal access to services, universal basic services. Rock, you emphasized this. So yeah, I think there's still a lot of work ahead, but it's certainly becoming a more appealing and even mainstream concept than it was years ago. So I suppose that's some reason for optimism.
Yeah, I think that pandemics kind of has shown that this, but in different form, is even possible, because I think Austria and probably Germany was kind of paying some kind of fee or type of assistance to the artists during the pandemics.
Also in Slovenia, in some supplements.
Yeah. So I think, like, if that is possible during the pandemics, if that's possible, like when there's no pandemic. So
yes,
I think, like, it's
minus the enormous debt that all the countries took during the pandemic. Yeah, money could be better than
yeah.
So Katja, thank you very much. It was very interesting. Yeah.
Do we want to cut it, or I also have maybe?
Sorry.
I also wanted to pose a question.
Just go.
Yeah, thanks so much, Katja, and lots of overlaps with my own thinking and research as well. Yeah, maybe just as a first, I wanted to just bring attention to this a novel that's in some ways similar but very contemporary, like 2017. It's called Walk Away by Cory Doctorow. Actually, a friend talked shit about another book of his, but well, the concept sounds interesting and somewhat similar. And there's this, I don't know if you know, this group, I don't know if it's active anymore, but called the Science Fiction Economics Lab. And it was actually run by this guy named Ivan Cukaric. I think he's from Zagreb, but not living in Croatia, as it seemed, like in Belgium or something, which is also a theme we've been seeing here with people moving out and such. Yeah, it's a really interesting platform, and they mapped out different fiction books and how their economic systems work. And for Walk Away, the entry is like depicts an economy entirely based on DIY production, made cheap at an arbitrarily small scale by advanced 3D printing and biotech. Production is organized like a Wikipedia-style project. And the book makes the argument that reputation bookkeeping, like kudos or karma, etc., invites gaming of the system and is an inferior way to organize production to a pure gift economy, given some key abundances. And it also makes the case for deflection from mainstream society, exit in Hersman's terms, as a viable strategy when cheap open technology is available. So that's just a little plug-in. Like I had yeah, maybe a question that I wanted to explore with you. Like obviously this speculation comes in the form of a book, and I'm thinking, yeah, fiction in various media like have obviously different strengths and so on, different kind of stages of, yeah, how much this medium is really accessible, and how much do people who are, yeah, kind of under the brutalism of everyday capitalism kind of really have the time or the will to kind of engage with this stuff. So in a lot of sense, people who would pick up these books are kind of, yeah, the already converted ones. And then if we think about, if we were to translate these ideas into more performance type things, right? Like, but then again, is, you know, the certain classes, are they gonna go to a theater, you know, and so on. So then we also have to be thinking, yeah, of the methods of producing these things, right? A lot of it, it's like this one or two authors kind of with this, you know, maybe it's a very great vision, such as, you know, you described, like way ahead of its time in many ways. But then it can, you know, like, I don't know, in a Kim Stanley Robinson fashion, kind of become this, you know, very, very kind of, yeah, I don't know, very specific way of framing and so on. Whereas, yeah, if you're coming to this in a kind of co-production, co-design kind of way, and you're trying to get people involved in co-producing these possible futures that are also kind of reflexive by default and meant to be revisited, adjusted. So, you know, at the biggest scale of, you know, this kind of performance and co-design venture I can think of is actually, you know, a kind of transition model itself. Like if we had, say, a space in major cities around the world where you could, you know, kind of in an actual physical space, kind of affirm these alternatives, kind of, and co-create them and perform them and so on, and kind of streamline that into, you know, the policy process and polity changes necessary. Yeah, obviously we don't have the funds for that. But, you know, we will make do with, you know, smaller scale productions and so on. But yeah, I think capitalism also exploits to some extent this, you know, on the one hand, it's saying there's no alternative. And on the other hand, it's saying, you know, Silicon Valley basic income and so on. And I think, yeah, having such a space affirmed and recognized by, you know, yeah, sizable segment of the local community, I think could be a kind of powerful, yeah, utopian reflexive project / mirror onto society. And I was just wondering, yeah, maybe just general reflection on these, you know, different mediums, the kind of co-design aspect and kind of transformative potentials of this.
Yes, that's a great question, and a very difficult one, obviously. I mean, it's true that a book is as limited as it is, and you know, it performs certain functions. It cannot perform all of them. So a book will not change society, but it can of course function as a vector of ideas, I suppose. And I think even today, and I see this in organizing reading groups, that there is a certain interest in, and I suppose that's also where these ideas about the syllabi that Tomislav Medak was talking about come from, that there is a need and a desire to read about certain things and think about certain things, even though that's quite some steps removed from actually putting them into practice, or even experimenting with what should be put into practice. So yes, that's I certainly agree, and I also think we should not expect from books or theories to do what they cannot by definition do. But yes, then what is the kind of better medium, or better or appropriate medium get these ideas across maybe to more people, or even to get more people to tune into creating those ideas is, of course, I suppose, the big question we are dealing with, and we are circling with ever, you know, also from the first presentation, this question of how to make a certain movement global. How do you actually reach a global kind of constituency and involve people? It's very difficult, because even, I mean, and of course, you know, technologies today, information technologies enable a lot, but there's also a question of access to that. There's many people that don't have access, and I mean especially an elderly demographic, for instance. There's so many services also that are digitized and so on, and I always wonder, how do people that were not digitally schooled even have access to that? So, you know, how do you get people who are users, for instance, of elderly care services to participate in what kind of elderly care system should be developed? How do you even start, you know, how do you start this process of communication and so on? So yes, it's very difficult. I think also we never, maybe Tomislaw's kind of admonition not to necessarily lose ourselves in thinking too big, in setting ourselves huge goals and then being disappointed because we cannot reach them, but think about the scale on which we can work and on which we can be effective, and then related to that, the kind of medium or the kind of process that would be appropriate. I don't know, that's not very conclusive as an answer, but I'm just thinking with you about what direction of thought could maybe be useful in this case. Yeah, I don't know.
Thank you. And yeah, as you said, it's a difficult question, and we'll keep returning to it, I think, in our
I have one question also. So thank you, Katja. It was very interesting. So when reading Firestone, it is quite radical, basically. She's quite radical in her writing. She proposes a way of living and abolishing gender, and the place that she dedicates to children and so forth, being the part of course, of society, and also sexual society and so forth. So it's going beyond, I don't know, she proposes something that is controversial, and maybe this is also something that opens up the space for, not just being polite and propose things that, are expected, but to go beyond that. So I like the thing that you said, that the book is somehow a political manifesto, but it's also a speculative imagination. So it's both, and it could be both, or it should be both. So I like this equation, being of course to use this imagination as a political manifesto to create an open spaces that can't be imaginable, basically. So for me, this part is quite important. And as you know, this Yugo-futurism it has its own problems, because it's dealing with the past and the future at the same time, and it doesn't really know how to grasp the past. Yugo-futurism doesn't want to be nostalgic, but in some way it is correlated to geopolitical situation in Yugoslavia. So I'm just wondering, because it's very particular, this proposal of Yugo-futurism, and do we have some, of course, initiatives or some kind of thoughts that could be developed on further for Yugo-futurism regarding feminist perspective? We can, of course, deal with more universal topics in this, of course, speculative imagination, but I think it's also important to go into these particularities of this space, maybe.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. I mean, I think so. I think one interesting thing where let's say where reading Firestone today comes close to thinking about Yugofuturism is also in the relationship to time that we articulate and to history. There is a very nice essay from Katie Weeks about so in feminist theory tends to be this kind of is a kind of newer discipline, and it tends to understand itself as progressing all the time, and in progressing killing its its foremothers, if you want. So where 1970s feminism is seen as this essentialist white feminist binary and so on, superseded ideas. And she says, well, it would be more profitable to see it well, it would be more useful for us today to see it as a kind of archive of ideas for today, so that of course you have limited kind of experiences, limited kind of analysis there. In Firestone, as mentioned, this chapter on race, which is very problematic, although she's a committed anti-racist, and her argument is that, but she has a very weird analysis of race. Anyway, so there are mistakes, there are things you would consider, we wouldn't do this today, we wouldn't talk about this today in this way, but nevertheless there are also these kinds of ideas which can prove very useful. And so I think one part of this project may be articulating a certain philosophy of history or understanding of time that is not this kind of linear progressive idea, we are always developing better things, but rather how do you approach the past in a way that is not romanticizing, fetishizing, demonizing, but in a way makes use of what is important for us today and interesting for us today. And in relation to feminism in Yugoslavia, I mean, I'm not an expert on the topic specifically, but I think this an analogous kind of reading could be maybe done of feminist movements in Yugoslavia, as what I have mentioned about Firestone. So in the sense that, for instance, I think one interesting lesson for us is how the state used to view feminism as this kind of bourgeois pursuit. We are not dealing with that. Socialism will take care of women's issues. At the same time, there have been many advances in women's equality and so on, simply under the socialist regime. So this kind of double ambiguous relationship to feminism as a movement that the state had, and I think one can learn from that. So what do we think about feminism in a certain as dealing with certain topics of certain women with a certain class position? What do we think about it as being solved simply by economic restructuring? And then I think the kind of independent movements that were forming in the late 70s and 80s were also a kind of reaction to this kind of understanding, saying, okay, but there's homophobia, there's women's issues that have not been solved, although we have access to abortion and so on, and wage labor, but still women do carry the bulk of reproductive work and so on. So I think thinking about this kind of relationship between economic restructuring, economic redistribution, and sex, gender liberation is one arena where the experience of or of feminism in Yugoslavia, feminisms in Yugoslavia maybe can be fruitful. But yes, I don't know. That's very preliminary because, like I said, I'm not specifically an expert on the history of Yugoslav feminisms. But yeah.
Maybe just one question. You said that you are now translating Ursula Le Guin, and no?
No, I'm not translating. No. No, I think I just mentioned what I'm reading at the moment, which is James Tripty Jr. I'm not translating currently.
Okay, I understand you. Yeah, I didn't understand this correctly.
I want you to translate.
Yeah. I think.
Sorry?
Vera said that I want you to translate Ursula.
Well, on that note, I discussed this with Tea Hvala. I don't know if you know that she wrote her diploma thesis on Ursula Le Guin. And we were discussing, no, not on Ursula Le Guin, I'm sorry, on Octavia Butler. So no, actually I kind of confused things. So we were discussing translating Octavia Butler, but yeah.
Super.
But Ursula Le Guin, of course. But there are the translations, Rock, you brought them here or not?
Yeah.
Of Ursula's novels, no? Mm.
Yeah, Word for World is Forest and Left Hand of Darkness, and as well at home. Yeah, it's not very well known, but those are translated in Slovenian as well. Besides the Earthsea and that more like fantasy series stuff.
Yeah. Which one would you want translated, Alia?
I don't know.
I
will think about it.
Carry Back Theory of Fiction. It's very short.
Yeah.
15 pages.
Back Theory of Fiction. Oh wow, yeah.
With an introduction by Donna Haraway. Yeah, what more would you like?
Sounds like a good suggestion for the Masca book program.
Thank you.
Thank you, Katja.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I'm really looking forward to see where your research takes you.